Good afternoon, everybody. It's now 12 o'clock on the East Coast and wherever you are. I am David Skok, the founder and CEO of The Logic, and this begins our fall series of events and conversations with leaders to help make your world a better place and to make our world a better place. I am delighted to have you join us. Those of you who are subscribers to The Logic, as always, we are grateful to have you. Those of you that are not subscribers and are joining us for the first time, welcome. This is part of the value of a subscription to The Logic, not just great journalism, but also great events. And I'm absolutely delighted to kick off our fall season with Carolyn Dewar. Carolyn is a partner, senior partner at McKinsey and Company, and co-wrote with Scott Keller and Vikram Malhotra, CEO Excellence. This is a book that provides the 6 mindsets that distinguish the best leaders from the rest. And if there were ever a time to have a conversation like this, it's now. I was reminded, as like many of you, I was shot from a cannon last week, dropping my kids off at school and then getting right into the September swing of work, that perhaps it's time to also do a little work on my own abilities as the CEO of The Logic. And so let's bring in Carolyn if we can. Carolyn, welcome to The Logic, and we're delighted to have you. And I should also point out what I didn't say there is that Carolyn is also a Canadian and British citizen who worked for a long time in the Toronto office of McKinsey, if I'm correct.
Absolutely. No, a Canadian at heart, born and raised.
So congratulations on the book. It's now this doesn't say it on this one, but I've seen in more recent copies, it now says you're a New York Times bestseller. How has the book tour gone, and how, well, before we get into that, maybe just tell us a little bit about what led you to go down this path of writing CEO Excellence.
Absolutely. And thanks so much for having me today. I've been really looking forward to the conversation. I mean, you're right. It's a fair question. Why does the world need another business book, right? And I think as we looked out there, we found a couple of things. There's lots of books on leadership broadly, and there's lots of books about specific CEOs, right? You can read books about Jack Welch or Satya Nadella or others, but no one that we could find had really looked across CEOs to say, what's the pattern, right? As you said, the world needs great leaders right now more than ever. And so what are those clues for how you be a great leader, whether it's CEO or another senior leadership role? What sets them apart, folks who do this role really well? And so we wanted to take a pretty analytical approach, right? Who has excelled in the role? And we had criteria for what that looked like. And then once we identified who's really excelled, we talked to them, right? We sat down one-on-one with about 70 of the world's best CEOs for several hours at a time, and really kind of pulled back the curtain to say, what do you do well? What's really hard? What lessons have you learned? And wanted a chance to share with everyone some of those hard-won lessons.
How did you get, and I did notice, if you, at the back of the book, there are bios of the 67 CEOs that you spoke with. How did you get them to be honest with you? And I asked that as a journalist.
Yeah.
There's always this tendency to sell yourself, perhaps, and maybe that's one of the 6 responsibilities of a CEO, which we'll get into. But how did you get them to open up enough to share honestly the challenges of running a company?
I think it's a great question, and really was a huge part of our motivation. Was we didn't want the stock standard answers, right? We really wanted to understand. I think we had 2 things going in our favor. One, curiously, it was during the pandemic. We did all the interviews in that first year of the pandemic when people were at home. And so, to be honest, they were at home on their couches without their chiefs of staff and their head of communications and all of their handlers. And I also think people were in a reflective moment, right? They were incredibly busy, but it was also causing all of us to step back and really say, what is our role? How do we need to lead? And I think the final piece, and it's such a common phrase that being a CEO is a lonely role, but I think it truly is. And we talked to many of them about why that is. But I think because of that, they were very, very open to sharing. I think once they understood that this was about helping others get up the learning curve fast and learn the things they wish they'd known, I think there was incredible willingness to share, because people just don't have a chance to do that very often. And I think they really wanted to be able to be helpful.
And I was surprised to learn in the book that Nothing like this had been done before. You would have thought with all the self-help gurus and the
Yeah.
business sections of an Indigo or an Amazon, you see all of these books that are successful, like you mentioned, Jack Welch. Um, Nobody had ever done a study of this size.
Not that we had seen in this way. There's been some studies, if you look at Harvard and other places, they've done calendar analyses of CEOs, for example, but they really take all the CEOs and they just play back or hold up the mirror. Here's what they do. They hadn't necessarily parsed apart, well, who's actually being effective and not effective, right? It was more just an average or a mirror of what the average performance or typical behaviors were. And I think that's the lens that was interesting. We wanted to overlay who has outperformed and then what's different about those folks. And the reason the subtitle is about mindsets is that ended up being the differentiator, right? Everyone has their own way of acting and behaving, but there was a way of thinking or a mindset that was quite consistent with these folks.
Okay, so let's get into those mindsets. Before we do, John, I'll ask you to call up the slide that we have ready for this, but also uh, a welcome. Encourage everybody to ask questions. This is your time as much as it is mine, if not more. So please feel free to ask questions. We're gonna, I think, as a way, we're gonna kind of treat this like a syllabus. Here are the 6 areas, and Carolyn will walk through each one and how they work, and then we will try to apply them to real life scenarios and how they can be applied in today's environment. So, um, Carolyn, why don't you start by first, teeing this up for us? These 6 parts of this honeycomb that you've illustrated, and how all of them. I think the analogy that you used was a sailboat, which I loved. Just how we should think about what's on the screen.
Absolutely. And I know this is a lot. This is our attempt to have a single cheat sheet. So there you go. If you don't read the book, here's it all on a page. The first question we were answering was, well, what is the CEO role anyway? And that's where you come up with these 6 pieces in the middle, right? Not particularly controversial, but there was a magic to seeing it all in one place. When we talked to these CEOs, again, Jamie Dimon, Mary Barra, Marilyn Houston, these huge complicated companies, it all came back to these 6 almost spinning plates, was another analogy folks used, that they're trying to keep going at the same time, right? You need to set the direction for the organization, make sure everyone knows where we're going. You need to align and mobilize the organization. So talent, culture, org design, are we set up for success? You need to mobilize through leaders. And this one is even more unique for CEOs, right? Your job really is to lead through others. It's not your job to be in there yourself. And for some, that's really hard, right? How do you find that right operating model? For the pieces that surprised new CEOs, 68% of CEOs said the job is not what they thought it was. A lot of that is these 3 on the right. They're surprised about engaging with the board. What does that really look like? Right? They say, well, I've been to a board meeting. I know what it's all about. It's very different when you're in the CEO shoes. Connecting with stakeholders, external stakeholders. This is the one that's changed the most probably in the last several years. The number of people who have opinions on your business. Who do you listen to? What topics do you engage on or not? And then this last piece of managing your own personal effectiveness. So, how you spend your time, how you show up as a leader. These are the 6 parts of the role that every CEO is trying to make sure is happening at the same time. What you see in the bold text around are these mindsets, right? So, how was it that these truly excellent CEOs were thinking as it related to each of those roles that really set them apart? And we can spend time on each of those, but it's these blue font mindsets that really set them apart.
Okay, so these are the 6. It's a lot. We recognize that. Um, they're not all, I'm a CEO. I'm not supposed to be thinking about all 6 of these at the same time. They are ebb and flow at all times. Is it, very similar to the Ronald Heifetz sense of, I'm on the dance floor versus the balcony? How do you measure when these things are on the front burner versus the back burner?
Absolutely. And I think that's where this spinning plates analogy can be helpful. They all need to be happening, right? And it's up to you as a CEO a little bit to recognize when one's maybe wobbling and about to drop, and you need to dive in and make it helpful. But I also think, Satya Nadella had a fascinating quote when we were talking about why it can be a lonely role. And he said, well, I know why it's lonely. It's an information asymmetry problem. No one underneath you sees what's happening on all of these 6 dimensions the way you do. And frankly, no one above you, he meant his board, sees what's happening on all these dimensions. And there's work itself in being that integrator, the person who sees all 6, sees if they're adding up and if the interdependencies are working well. And that in and of itself is work, right? So you need to keep them all happening, and you need to say, are they all adding up to where you need to go? But as you say, the relative emphasis may switch over time. If 5 of them are going great and one of them is the one that's a little wobbly, that's where you'll spend more time.
I should have asked this at the beginning in terms of methodology, but some of the interviews, were they all public company CEOs, or was it a bit, a nonprofit, government, or private founder led companies as well?
The majority are public company. We have a bit of a mix, but we did anchor in public company because we wanted the lessons to apply most broadly. We have a few founder CEOs, like Reed Hastings is in there, for example, but we didn't want to over-index on founder CEOs. Frankly, they have degrees of freedom that typical CEOs don't necessarily have. There's some family-owned business. We have some not-for-profit. We had the Cincinnati Children's Hospital and some other organizations, but it's the majority is public company.
Okay, great. And you answered my question, which was there a difference from founders versus somebody who's adopting the role? Okay, let's start with be bold here, setting the direction. As I was saying to you before we started, it's now for a lot of companies running a calendar fiscal. It's now time to think about 2023, starting to plan ahead and forecast. And yet there are so many uncertainties in our world at the moment. How on earth are you supposed to, as a CEO, set the direction when you don't know which way the wind is blowing? And what have they said about some of those challenges that people may have, or CEOs may have, when in times of crisis or uncertainty?
Absolutely. And we've been in a sort of crisis mode or uncertainty the last few years, and it seems to just be amplifying. I think this is where the role of the CEO or the senior leader is even more critical, right? To be able to look a little bit further out. It doesn't mean you're blind to the near-term realities, but look a little bit further out and keep the organization focused on the broader vision for the company or the organization, what you're trying to get done, right? You think of this first point on setting vision, and the excellent CEOs really reframing the game for their organization. What does that mean, right? It really means, rather than getting myopically focused on the near-term win or what we're trying to do, they give permission to the organization to remember and reimagine where we're going. If I take practical example, Ajay Banga, when he took over at MasterCard 10 years ago, all the hallway chatter was about, how do we beat Amex? How do we beat Visa? Right? And they were quibbling over market share, which, if you think back 10 years, credit cards were still only 8% of the world's transactions, and everyone was fighting for market share. And as the CEO, he was able to step back and say, actually, there's a much bigger game here. I'm going to reframe the game that we're playing. We're trying to transform the world of transactions. The phrase he actually used was, we're trying to kill cash. But it's this idea of, there's a whole world out there, and we need to think big and boldly about where it is we want to go. And I think companies that are navigating through the uncertainty now, they're not losing sight of that bigger game. And in fact, some organizations are finding this as an opportunity to kind of readjust who they're trying to be, what they're trying to do in the world, make bold moves. To be honest, there's some real M&A activity happening and other things happening. So who do you want to be in 2 years, 5 years? And what are the small moves you can make now? I think that's where the CEO role can really come in. You can lift people up a little bit and make sure you don't miss the bigger game.
It's funny that you bring up MasterCard, because, correct me if I'm wrong, they do not do annual forecasting. They are a different type. I mean, maybe just talk a little bit about that in terms of how that plays with setting the direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And a number of companies have moved away from kind of a rigid annual process, right? Because you need to be much more nimble. But they're very clear on what winning looks like for them, where they were trying to go. And they have rapid cycles of letting ideas bubble up and see. So when they started to go into online or debit card and things like that, they always have the opportunity to make those pivots. If you take, I mean, Mary Barra, when she took over as CEO, was making a real pivot towards electric vehicles, and is a great story of putting your money where the mouth is. She ended up pivoting 50% of their R&D spend, which is a massive amount for a big, incumbent company like that, towards placing bets for where they're going in the future. And it meant that she made some tough moves. They withdrew from countries they'd been in for 20 years and had never made money. But it was seen as, well, of course we have to be there. That's what we do. And even as a promoted from within CEO, she had the courage to kind of take a fresh eye view and say, is that really what we need to be doing? Or can we make some bolder pivots? And you see that in organizations, to your point, whether it's in 90-day sprints or broader sprints, they're constantly adjusting and pivoting and saying, are the things we're doing every day getting us to where we want to go?
Is there a difference between how a Mary Barra at GM would handle that because of the maturity of the business relative to another company that's maybe on a shorter, a Mark Zuckerberg or Reed Hastings, who, Netflix is part of our lives, but it's not a very old company. Did you see differences in leadership styles?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, big incumbent companies, it can be harder to pivot because there's so much ingrained, routine around, here's who we are, this is what we do. The average budget tweaks about 2 to 3% across business units. Yet those who outperform, it's more of a 10% swing. It takes real courage to do that for business units and functions that have been around for many years. In some ways, when you're in a fast growth mode, there's an expected kind of nimbleness. Although, think about Netflix now, right? They're classic in that they disrupted themselves. Their bigger vision was to entertain the world, which let them disrupt themselves from a mail order DVD company to streaming. And I think they're facing similar questions again. What does entertain the world look like now? Is it gaming? Is it other things? Is it even people just still sitting and watching streaming or not? And so I think they're having to continue to challenge themselves on those questions.
Great. John, if you can bring up the slide again, please. I wanted to move to the second honeycomb here, where we have align the organization. And this is a really interesting in that, you're seeing a lot of companies right now consolidating or merging units as they all work to become a little bit more efficient. Now, the cynical part of my brain would say, well, they're just in cost-cutting mode. But even when you're in cost-cutting mode, you still have to be strategic about how you find those efficiencies, to use a euphemism. So maybe share a little bit more about the aligning the organization element of this and how leaders think about organizational design. And I also, before you answer, just want to prompt everybody, please have questions ready. We're here to ask them. Any questions in particular for Carolyn, we'd be delighted to share. So, Carolyn.
Absolutely. So the mindset around align the organization is treat the soft stuff as the hard stuff, right? I think we were reminded time and time again through all these interviews that truly excellent CEOs take the organizational dimensions extremely seriously with the same amount of rigor as operational or strategic initiatives. They don't leave them to chance. They don't leave them to HR. And so when they think about the culture required, potentially culture shifts, the talent required and the org design required, they're very thoughtful about how does our organization need to operate in order to get done what we need to get done. So to your point on efficiency, maybe if we weave together the org design and the talent piece, right? The phrase we use on talent is don't put people first, which, by design is a little cheeky. Of course, CEOs put talent first, but the way they were thinking about it as it related to talent and org design was quite interesting. They were thinking about their strategy and what do we need to get done? And then they could draw a direct line to, so what are the roles that matter most for us to be effective in our strategy? Not necessarily what's the list of high potential people that I always think about, or what's the org design. What are in a big organization, 50 to 100 roles that disproportionately will make or break our ability to win in the market? It could be a digital and analytics capability. It might be a country manager in a specific country where you're expecting a lot of growth, right? In insurance, it might be your claims adjusting organization, which kind of can really swing whether or not you make money. But they had a really clear view of these are the roles that really matter. And then the talent, the culture, the org design should all be in service of helping those roles be wildly successful, right? In some companies, it's the frontline role, right? The direct interface with the customer. And then how does the whole organization line up to help those roles do what they need to do? And it impacts talent. So as people are worried about the great attrition and attracting and retaining talent, as the CEO, you disproportionately pay attention to the talent in those roles. Do you have A players? Do you have a good backup? Or is there a retention risk for folks in those roles? As you think about org design, are those the roles that are buried many levels down and have to go through a million approvals to get anything done? Or are we going to elevate them and help them really run? And so it's quite a strategic, business-oriented view, right? What do we need to enable to get done, and how does everything else act in service of that?
And I will use my own executive privilege to just point out we had a terrific article this morning from Murad Hamadi in The Logic about Shopify's transformation of its executive ranks. And you should go read that if you want to see a little bit of some of the aligning the organization in coming to life in real life. Okay, back to the 6 responsibilities. Let's go to mobilize through leaders. The composition, teamwork, and operating rhythm. Now, I must say, I know as a McKinsey person, you believe in MISI, mutually exclusive categories. This one confused me a bit because it seemed a lot like aligning the organization. So maybe help me understand the distinctions between the two.
Absolutely. So and they do overlap a little bit, right? But they're a slightly different lens. So align the organization is about the company or the organization broadly, right? Are we aligned and mobilized? Do we know where we're going? This third part on mobilizing through leaders is most focused on your own top team. So as a CEO or a most senior leader, I think one of the big realizations leaders have is I can't possibly be doing all the things anymore. The scale of my role is too big. And that my job, and where I frankly spend a significant portion of my time, is coaching the leaders to run the organization, right? And that broad top team. So both as individuals, but more importantly, as a collective, how are you collectively going to lead this company? What's your operating rhythm? How often do you meet? What do you meet on? What are the decisions that you make collectively as a unit? What kinds of markers or measurement do you look at? So what's that rhythm that the leadership team is using to run the place, essentially? Because I think a lot of CEOs are surprised that at least, in typical times, maybe not in a crisis, you want that team to be running the organization most of the time. And really you're coming in on strategic pivots or on problems and spending a significant portion of your time on board, external stakeholders, investors, all the other things. And so this is more about what's that rhythm where you have the team humming, that they're just kind of run the place most of the time. And there's some real investment you need to make as a team. We talk about not having a team of all-stars, but having an all-star team, right? This isn't just about having great folks, but they need to be working well together in a highly productive way.
There's a question that's tied to this from Claudio, which I'll ask Claudio Rojas. We mentioned Netflix, which has co-CEOs now. How do co-CEOs work in this kind of an environment?
I mean, we've done a bit of a deep dive into co-CEO models. It's not typical. It's not necessarily the easiest governance, but you do see it. And increasingly, actually, you see it often in founder-led companies. Sometimes and as is the case here, where you have Reed and someone else, right? Some would have even said that Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl were essentially co-CEOs, although they didn't have different title. So sometimes you get this split, more typically in founder-led, where there's sort of the visionary person who still wants to shape the company, and they want someone else to run the day-to-day business. That's sort of a typical split that you see. It's a tough one. I mean, there's 3 things that need to be true to make co-CEOs work, right? You need to have really clear division of roles and responsibilities amongst yourself, so you're not tripping over each other. At the same time, you need a mechanism and a forum, usually daily, to stay in sync so that you're really, connecting and making joint decisions where you need to. And then the third part is how you interact with the organization and provide a united front. What you need to avoid is sort of the child to parent thing where I asked mom, I didn't like the answer. So when I go and ask the other parent, hoping to get a different answer. And so how you're operating with the rest of the organization is key. But it's a tricky one. I would say executive chair is another one that's increasingly common, with the outgoing CEO sticking around for a year or two, keeping their office, coming to work every day. It's also a tough model.
We have some questions that we will get to, but let's keep going with the 6 responsibilities for now. And the next one up is engaging the board. Uh, it's, I would imagine, certainly from the reporting that we've done and others, that this is an interesting time in board CEO relations, particularly for smaller or startup companies, which have had investors. Valuations have been crazy, and um, expectations may not have always necessarily met what the valuations have been. And all of a sudden, with the cost of capital going up, you see more pressure on CEOs coming from boards. So I'm just trying to combine these two things here. Tell us about first how you engage a board as a CEO in a good way, and then you smack interest rates going up and money becoming more expensive, and how you deal with a board during a time of crisis.
Absolutely. I think this is the one where we saw the biggest difference between prevailing wisdom and these really excellent standout CEOs. I mean, it's a little presumptuous, but prevailing wisdom in some ways is the board is something to be tolerated, right? You get through the board meeting. I get to go back to running my business now. These CEOs really took a different mindset. Now, to be fair, I don't think they all started out this way, but they had come to this point of much more radical transparency and a mindset of how do I help the directors help me and help the business? And if that was my goal, to have the board be truly helpful to me, what would I do differently? I'd do a couple of things. First, I would make sure there's people on the board who actually have relevant skills and experience to bring to bear, given what we're trying to get done. And obviously, as a CEO, you don't have complete control over the board composition, but you can often work with your chair and over time evolve the board to make sure you have people who are relevant and helpful, right? The second one is the level of transparency that you bring. You'd have to give them enough information. You're focused on this every day. They may be engaged for a day, a month, right? So, how are you feeding them information so that they can be helpful, that they know enough, right? And this is not about reams and reams of binders that you deluge them with. Are you giving them timely, easily digestible information so they can get it quickly? And then the last part is about how you actually show up in the meeting, right? So, and we heard time and time again about CEOs having very candid and open one-on-one time with the board, or one-on-many time with the board. Jamie Dimon does it for an hour at the beginning of every meeting. No paper. Here's what's keeping me up at night. I don't necessarily need you to make a decision, but I'm giving you the heads up so that if it hits the fan and I'm back in 3 months, you'll know that there was something bubbling up, right? Ivan at Diageo has a 7x7 list. The 7 things that are, troubling him, and the 7 things he's really proud of. And he shares those every meeting. All of that supports this notion of bringing the board along, being more transparent than maybe new CEOs are comfortable being, good, bad, and ugly, so that when you have those tough times like we're having now, you have a baseline of trust and transparency and credibility that you can have the tougher conversations. So in many ways, you've kind of put that into your bank account and you can draw on it in times like now.
It's fascinating because the natural tendency would be to tell the board all the good things are going on, not
Right.
necessarily shield them from the bad stuff, and then also to shield yourself from a board getting too involved in operational matters to try to help you in good faith, right? So
Right.
it's interesting that the more it shouldn't come as a surprise, filling the vacuum. The more of a vacuum there is, the more people will want to fill. So how do you manage that?
Yeah.
Um, I'm seeing a question that just came in on board, so I'm going to read this in real time. And what can boards do to invite CEOs into the new mindset around radical transparency? Are there conditions boards can create to make board CEO collaboration the preferred approach?
It's a great question. I've had the privilege of spending time with a number of board chair roundtables where they've been asking this question, right? I do think that there's an expectation setting, whether it's with the new CEO or at any period. You can choose to take stock and say, time out. Can we reset our model and have a really open and honest conversation about it? I think that being said, when the CEO then is having the courage to share some of that, the way that the board responds the first time or two will set the tone of whether or not that's going to work, right? If they're courageous and share some not great news and the board overreacts, they're not going to do it again, right? So it's a little bit of a two-way relationship that you have to build of trust. A baby step is the relationship between the CEO and the chair, right? So even if you don't want to go to your whole board and kind of air your dirty laundry, most of the CEOs we talk to are talking to their chairs, once a week. A lot of them have a standing Friday afternoon call. That's probably a safe testing ground to start sharing some of this. And maybe the chair can help have some sideline conversations to prep, so it's not a shock when you say it in the room.
I should just, for the record, point out that I have a terrific board. They're just the best. And our board chair is even better. All right. Number 5, calling up the 6 responsibilities of the CEO again, is connect with stakeholders. Okay, this is a big one, right? I mean, you can tee it up, but there's a lot going on in our world, and that is, you look at the Edelman surveys, the annual Edelman Trust Survey, the barometers, and a lot of it is pointing towards the role of private companies or public companies and CEOs in actually influencing or being responsible for the world around them. So, this is probably the newest, I would say, challenge for CEOs in our world.
I think that's right. And you're right. We've even challenged ourselves. If we were to have done this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, would this piece of the honeycomb be there? I think it would have been, and it would have had investors on it, maybe regulators. Pretty simple list, customers, right? That list has grown, right? Media, public opinion, social interest groups, just a huge number of voices now who both have an opinion on the business. And to your point, CEOs are also being called upon to have opinion on other things that they feel in many cases are outside of their 4 walls. And of all of the sections, this is the one I think that's changed the most, and where perhaps CEOs feel most out on a limb in terms of what issues should they weigh in on, which stakeholders should they engage with or not, when really in simpler times, their job was to run their company over here in the corner, right? I think those days are gone, but people are trying to figure out what does this new role that they're being asked to play mean. I was with the CEO a while ago who described it as 3 concentric circles, right? There's the stuff in your own 4 walls, which sure, if you're being called out on ESG or diversity or other issues within your own 4 walls, that's a responsibility and something that you need to take care of, right? So that one feels clearer. The next one out feels also moderately clear, which is it affecting your ability to operate, right? So trade issues, supply chain issues, things that are directly in the way of your ability to operate or not as a company. You could imagine a credible reason why you might weigh in on those and engage. I think it's this outermost circle that people are looking for a rubric for, right? Socio-political issues, race issues, gender issues, Supreme Court issues, all of these things where, in time gone by, a CEO would have said, well, that's not my job. I shouldn't weigh in on that. And some CEOs are still hoping to say that. I think what's changed is that in many cases, employees and customers are now making their employment decisions or their purchasing decisions based on whether or not this company is in line with my values. That's sort of a whole new world for CEOs to navigate. And it's complicated by the fact that your stakeholders may not agree, right? So you take Brad Smith, who was the CEO of Intuit. He retired a year or 2 ago. And this is not a political statement. It's just the situation he was in. He's based in Northern California. All of his employee base are here. It was the morning after the election that Trump was elected, and his employees wanted him to make a public statement about how terrible the election outcome was. What do you do? Right. And it was, the country was split down the middle. Now, he navigated it fairly well and came out with this statement about, look, I'm not making an opinion on the election result, but what you can count on us for as a company, what our values are and what we stand for are these types of things around tolerance and diversity and things like that. That's the way he navigated having an employee base in a very different place, than his customers, which were on both sides of the aisle across the country, right? It would have been a terrible business to take a stand that alienated half your customer base. I think it's getting even trickier, and people are trying to navigate um, where do I take a stand or not? I think a lot of CEOs got spooked by what happened with Disney in Florida. I think Roe versus Wade, people are now saying, again, they're threading this line of, well, what our employee healthcare benefits are is this. They're not making a statement opining on Supreme Court, but they're saying, here's what our employees can count on. But to be honest, it's tricky waters. I think the only stable rubric people are coming back to is starting with their sense of why. Why does our company exist? What are we trying to do in the world? And what are our core values? And can we use that as a guide for how we navigate all of this? But I'd be curious, David, what you're seeing.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to me that you mentioned Disney in Florida, and for those that don't know, Governor Ron DeSantis, targeting Disney in a way for political whatever, as part of his choices to take on a private company for uh, his own purposes. I think what I observed through all of it, and this is leading to a question from Cheryl that we have, is that some of this is it used to be your fiduciary duty was your clear and only goal. And that in some ways tended to be more of a short-termism quarterly thing than a long-term thing. Now, when you have Larry Fink one day saying, as your LP, we want you to be thinking long-term, and then in the middle of a pandemic, maybe shifting that messaging a little bit. Uh, I guess the question from Cheryl that I'm trying to get at here is how do you as a CEO address that tension between long term and short term? And yes, I mean, I know you mentioned in terms of setting the direction and having the financials and the board management and all that, but how should a CEO or how are CEOs looking at addressing that tension?
Yes, two thoughts. The first is, you're right, there's been a lot of talk at the Business Roundtable and other places for years on stakeholder capitalism. And I think everyone kind of agreed to it in principle, right? It's not just about shareholders, it's about solving for multi stakeholders. And now we're actually figuring out how to operationalize that, right? You think about companies' decisions to withdraw from Russia was not necessarily a near term financial markets driven decision, right? They were clearly thinking about other stakeholders as they were doing that. And we're trying to figure out what that means now that the implications of those choices kind of come home to roost. I think in terms of short versus long term in particular, that is one of the paradoxes or tensions that CEOs have to hold, right, on behalf of their organization. And they need to tell their narrative, their story, both internally and externally to the markets in a way that's true. So it is your job as CEO to help investors and others understand what your long-term vision is, but break it down into here's the steps or the moves we're going to take to get from A to B. And here's what you can hold me accountable for and what to look for in our journey towards that vision. I think setting those expectations and then meeting them in the right way is one of the responsibilities of a CEO. I think if you're getting swung wildly by kind of short-term expectations, you're likely not setting the company up for success. And so the idea of having a coherent vision and narrative and pathway that you can talk about and you can point to is so important in setting expectations for everyone.
All right, one last time, let's call up the 6 responsibilities to get to our 6th one, which is managing personal effectiveness. This is about you yourself as a CEO and your own time and how you deal with a question here that we got about how do you deal with criticism, all those kind of things. So share with us what you observed from excellent CEOs and how they manage their personal time.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll pick off two, one specific on time and then broader. On time, it's this notion of, we say, managing a series of sprints, right? You think of it as a marathon or a sprint. I think what these CEOs recognized is it can't be a marathon because you can't wait till the end to show a result, right? But you need to be doing all of these sprints, both individually and for your organization. And that means you go hard for a little while and then you have a period of recovery. And these CEOs were surprisingly intentional about how they managed their calendar, whether it was a day, a month, or a year. They had thought ahead about, okay, this is going to be a tough period. So what's the recovery that I'm going to have to rejuvenate myself? to hit the next day or week or month. And they were quite aware of what recovery meant for them, what gave them energy. In some cases, it was, if it was daily, it was, I need to always go for my run, or I need to do this. Some CEOs knew that what energized them was market visits, going to see customers, right? For others, it was seeing their team. It was different for each person. But as they mapped out their calendar with their assistant and with their chief of staff, they made sure they built in some of that so they weren't just so dragged down that they couldn't perform. And I think it leads a little bit to this second idea of your to-be list. That phrase came from Michael, who was the CEO of Cincinnati Children's Hospital, but he took it quite literally. So he's a little old school. He prints out his agenda every day, his calendar. And next to his agenda of all his meetings, he writes next to each one, how does he need to be in that meeting? So no, what's not the to-do list, but how do I need to show up as a leader? Because as a leader, everything you do gets amplified. And you've all probably experienced that, right? You walk down the hallway with kind of a grumpy face and everyone freaks out and thinks that something terrible is happening with the business, right? Everything just gets amplified. And he's conscious of that. And so as he moves from the channel shifting that a CEO has to do, so a tough meeting with the lawyer where you find out you're getting sued, to a town hall with 1,500 people that you need to motivate, brand new employees, to maybe going and closing a deal with the big important customer all in one morning, you need to be conscious of how you show up in each of those moments. And it's not about being inauthentic. You still are yourself, but being thoughtful of, okay, in this moment, I'm going to need to be provocative and really push the team to think boldly. This one is about us celebrating and feeling good about what we've done. This one is about me being really decisive because I know this team has been spinning for a month and they just need someone to make a call. He was very thoughtful about that. And a number of CEOs had a similar methodology. And I think that's something, frankly, all of us can apply. Who do I need to be today? And how am I going to show up to be the leader my organization needs from me?
I was going to say a lot of this work is really practical and helpful advice for everyone, not just CEOs, which is why we have you here today. Okay, we only have a few minutes left here, so my last question for you, and it kind of leads to another question we have here, is what surprised you in this, in terms of what are the expectations that what assumptions did you have coming in that were changed as a result of this research? And finally, how has it changed over the last 15 years? I mean, some of the stuff, certainly in connecting with stakeholders, we know things like ESG were not really thought of 15 years ago in a lot of companies. But more broadly, how has the CEO themselves changed and evolved in the last 15 years?
I think in my mind, the surprise and the change is probably linked together
Yeah.
into an answer. I mean, I think the stereotype, and I probably held some of that walking in, is that these were going to be really big ego, I have all the answers, this is how I do it type leaders, right? And I think we were surprised and reminded time and again that that was not the typical CEO profile, at least not today. Maybe it was in the 80s, maybe it was in the 90s. Frankly, these roles are too big and too complex, and the stakeholders involved and the scale of the challenges they're facing are too big for anyone to possibly have all the answers and to be able to dictate down what's going to happen in the organization. Even some of the household name personalities you see on our list, where you'd be like, oh, okay, I bet that person, they weren't. I think they've all recognized a couple of things. One, they have to lead through leaders, right? It's the only way, given the scale of what they're doing, which means they're spending half their time coaching their team and really see that as the majority part of their job, right? That they personally have to always be learning. So the learning mindset of these CEOs was insatiable. Their curiosity, their willingness to be open to points of view, because they know they can't possibly know everything and that the issues are evolving so quickly. And then there was a humility. I think by design, we only talked to folks who'd been in roles 6 years or more because we wanted them to have a longer track record. And at least by that stage, most of them had developed a pretty healthy humility that they were occupying a chair for some period of time and that their job was to leave the company better than they found it. And when they get the fancy invites to Davos and all the various things, they realize it's their role that's being invited. right? It's not just them. And I think that's healthy and important, especially as they're then thinking about what's next and when's the right time for them to step aside and let the next generation come and lead. I think they were all asking the question, am I the right leader for this next era? And I think you can only do that when you're also comfortable that you're a person and have a life outside of the job too, right? And so there's this, in one way it's all consuming, in another way having a healthy distance and humility around it seems to be the magic.
Well, learning mindset is a good way to end this for two reasons. One, because CEO Excellence is a book that can help you learn a little bit more about how to be a great CEO. And two, because if you don't subscribe to the logic, every day we provide you with curiosity and things that will help you get into a learning mindset by keeping you informed so that you can make decisions around the six responsibilities of being a CEO. Carolyn, it's lovely to see you again. You are in San Francisco, but most of our audience is Canadian, and so welcome home. It's been lovely to be with you today. Thank you for this, and congratulations on all the success that you've had so far with the book.
Thanks so much. It's been terrific to talk to you.
Please, for those of you who are not subscribers, we do these events very often, and some of them are really interesting and informative, like the one we will be doing on Wednesday, September 28th. I'll be sitting down with our reporter, our automotive and tech reporter, Anita Balakrishnan. I can tell you, because I've edited her work, nobody knows more about the EV AV space in Canada than Anita, and you can actually sign up now for her free newsletter, Shift, and experience it for yourself. But we will also be hosting an event with Anita talking about the current state of the automotive industry from the combustion engine all the way to EVs. There's been so much change and so many government announcements and funding announcements and factories being set up across the manufacturing supply chain in Canada. Anita will try break that all down for us. That event, we will also be joined by Claudio Sciamma, the managing director of auto and consumer goods at Google, for opening remarks. And the event is sponsored by Google Think Auto. Thank you again to Carolyn for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of your September.